I am calling the Monday, May 2nd, 2022 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting to order at 6:33 p.m. Tonight's Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting will be held in person and virtually by using Zoom. As chair, I will be leading the Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting, and the public is welcome to participate when invited throughout the meeting. Members of the public may attend the meeting in person or join via Zoom online. If attendees experience audio problems, we suggest you leave the meeting and then rejoin. This usually fixes the issue. Additional instructions on how to participate are posted online at www.burnsvillemn.gov in the public meeting calendar. As usual, tonight's meeting is available for viewing on BCTV and the city's website. If you are unable to participate this evening and would like to submit public testimony, I encourage you to email your comments to city staff or mail your comments directly to City Hall. Now, on to the agenda. The first item on tonight's agenda is adoption of the agenda. Do any members of the commission have any changes? All right. Staff, do you have any changes to the agenda?
Nothing from staff.
Perfect. May I have a motion for the adoption of the agenda?
Move to adopt the agenda.
Second.
There is a motion to adopt and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Perfect, it passes. I will approve the minutes of the March 7th, 2022 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting minutes. Commissioners, are there any changes to the minutes? All right, staff, any changes to the minutes for you?
Nothing from staff.
Perfect. May I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Perfect, that carries. Are there any members of the public on Zoom who wish to speak?
Chairwoman, I'm not seeing anybody.
Perfect. And so then we will move on to the Lake Marion Greenway Natural Resources Improvement Plan. Chris Klatt from Dakota County, if we welcome you to come speak.
Thank you. Good evening, commissioners and staff member. My name is Chris Klatt. I'm a natural resources specialist with Dakota County Parks, and I wanted to come to you tonight for an informational item about the natural resources opportunities that exist along the Lake Marion Greenway. We've been in close communication with Caleb and Daryl at the city to discuss the natural resource management plan that the update that the city has come up with. So a lot of what you might be seeing here tonight might be familiar, but that was intentional. We really wanted to work lockstep with the city in terms of what the natural resource needs are in the parks and use this as an opportunity for the county greenway as a place where we can work in collaboration to do natural resource related activities. And so tonight I'm going to start my talk with just a brief overview of the Greenway Corridor as it travels through the city of Burnsville and other local communities. And I'll talk a little bit about the cost share program that the county has established in order to enable and facilitate the implementation of natural resource projects in along the Greenway. And then finally, I'll just give an update. We've been engaged with this natural resource management planning activity for this Greenway and another. And I'll give a quick update at the end of my talk to talk about where we are in that timeline and opportunities that we have to work in collaboration for engagement of the public and during this public draft review period. And then finally, I'd love to hear of any comments and questions that you might have about this project. So first, the context of this Greenway as it stands in the city of Burnsville. This trail largely occupies the western corridor of the city. As it moves south, it moves actually out of the county for a short period. This is just an alignment as it currently stands. It will eventually go through Murphy-Hanrahan Park and then southward towards Lakeville, where it will the trail will move through other city parks in the city of Lakeville, and then along an existing trail along the south of Lake Marion, which has been known in the past as the Juneau Trail. Eventually it will travel eastward towards Farmington, where it will the terminus will be in Rambling River Park, where the trail the Rambling River Park is where the Vermilion main stem and the North Creek of the Vermilion River meet. And then what you see on the east side there's another green line that indicates the North Creek Greenway, which was our natural resource management plans. We're working in tandem with this other plan. I'm just going to speak a little bit more about the Lake Marion Greenway on the western side tonight, but just to give you a little bit more context of this trail and its environs. So the Lake Marion Greenway in itself encompasses either 20 miles of established trail or trail alignments that are not yet in place. And it's adjacent to over 3,500 acres of public lands. And not all of these lands are currently natural spaces. Some of them are often used for turf areas and recreation. And so natural resource opportunities might not present themselves throughout those entire 3,500 acres, but we had an eye for natural resource improvements that we could collaborate on within those lands. And we came up with a total of about 1.5 million potential projects that we identified. And in particular, in the city of Burnsville, the areas that we talked with the city staff to highlight are areas within Rudy Kramer Nature Preserve, Sunset Pond Park, and Keller Park. Go into a little bit more detail on the alignment. This is an aerial photograph of the northern part of the Greenway in that western side of the city. So where the trail flows currently through Rudy Kramer Nature Preserve, there's been a lot of restoration activities that have occurred there over the past 7 or 8 years. And the trail currently moves southward through the park and then switchbacks up a steep slope where we identified areas that could be re-restored into a prairie landscape. And so we're looking at existing opportunities there. And then currently there aren't contiguous trail segments that connect Rudy Kramer to Sunset Pond, but that is in the works. Moving southward to Sunset Pond, again, this is established trail that moves through the eastern side of the park. And there are existing natural features in this park as there's been prairie restorations and invasive species management. However, as part of this Greenway process, and I'll go into a little bit more detail detailing the cost share and ongoing management that the county is willing to take on, we could assist in additional removing of invasive species such as buckthorn and honeysuckle, and engage in ongoing prairie management such as burning and in management of invasive species in a targeted fashion. We also identified areas along the shoreline that have been restored and could be enhanced, or additional plantings could be brought back to their native shoreline habitat, as there's a lot of hybrid cattail that's currently along the shoreline there, and so there could be opportunities to reintroduce native species on that shoreline. Then moving southward along Judicial Road, the trail eventually starts moving westward through Keller Park. And this trail segment was brought into the system just last year. Unfortunately, the trail alignment did cut through an existing prairie, but we are engaged in re-restoring segments of that trail, or re-restoring prairie along those segments of the trail, in addition to looking for other opportunities to do natural resource management projects. So I mentioned, one of the main reasons we're developing natural resource management plan is to develop implementation projects that could be brought forth for grant applications. And so while again this is in lockstep with the existing natural resource management plan update that the city was engaged in, there are other communities along this Greenway Corridor that don't have those planning processes. And so taking a lens through the Greenway Corridor and following those same steps for natural resource management planning, our hopes are to engage with the cities to do, to not only obtain grants, but also to help pay for them. I'll go into that in a little more detail momentarily, but what we identified as consistent with the natural resource management plan from the city was that there are 2 project areas within Kelleher Park that could benefit from partner grant opportunities. And that is this K1 region in the southern part where we Caleb and staff identified the need for additional hydrological studies to determine if this is a fen wetland, and if so, what kinds of resource management opportunities exist to enhance the native vegetation in this area and engage with additional hydrological needs. And also this K2 region on the northern side of the park. This K2 region has a high potential for becoming an oak savanna habitat. There are large mature white and bur oak trees in this part of the property, and there are also, it's heavily infested with old growth buckthorn, and so a lot of canopy management and invasive shrub removal would be needed to bring this habitat back to its former quality. So just to give an overview of what some of those activities would be, and I mentioned eliminating those exotic shrubs, removing secondary trees and shrubs such as those that grew since that was an oak savanna, and establish native grasses as a ground cover, which would then allow for the opportunity to use fire as a management tool. This picture was incidentally taken from Terrace Oaks, so this is what we hope that area to look like someday. In places where oak trees are maybe a little more abundant in the canopy, this would maybe be appropriate for a grass habitat in the understory, but perhaps an oak woodland would target still a largely forested plant community, but still needing the opportunity to remove exotic shrubs, thin some secondary trees such as box elder, and also to establish native shrubs and enhance the ground community. So in the plan, there are sections that itemize exactly what could be done within these regions. And this is just a short example of a package of project or activities that could be managed as a project that could then be put forth as a grant opportunity. And so we're looking at projects that are typically around $100,000, so this is an example of that. But what I wanted to go into detail a little bit more about is how the county and the city can work together to not only obtain those grant funds, but also to how the county could assist in managing lands along the Greenway. And so the county's come up with a few definitions of a Greenway corridor, depending on if it's in an urban, a suburban, or a rural context. And so within the city of Burnsville, we would consider this to be a suburban context in which the county would be willing to assist in a 200-foot wide corridor along the trail and managing those native plantings. And so that's one way in which, after restoration has occurred, the county could help in assisting with the costs in maintaining those areas. The 30-foot easement is typically owned by the county, and it offers very limited opportunities for natural resource work in that we have a 10-foot wide trail, often 3 feet of turf on either side of the trail, and we're left with another 4 feet of a strip of pollinator plantings and such. So it really makes sense to take this in context of a larger swath of land that is owned by the city, but that the county would be willing to manage. And then finally, the lands outside that corridor that are parkland owned by the city, that is another category of parkland that we consider in this cost share matrix. So I mentioned the 30-foot easement, that's totally the responsibility of the county. The Greenway Corridor is something that while the county would be willing to maintain in the long term, the initial restoration costs would be a 50-50 cost share between the city and the county for any grant match that would be needed for a project. And then finally, the natural lands beyond the corridor, typically there are grant funds available to do that work as a whole, so we wouldn't separate those corridors from a larger project, but rather the cost share of formula of that would largely be determined by the grant or our county's land conservation plan. So there might be an opportunity to have that same 50-50 cost share in those lands outside the corridor, or it could even be a 30/70, depending on the source of the funding. So to go back to this example that I presented to you earlier of a roughly $100,000 project, what that means from a city-county contribution perspective is that if we were applying for a state grant of, say, $86,000, the county and the city could bring 10% of those funds for a total project budget of $103 that would cover the cost of doing this restoration. So with that, I wanted to just give you an update as to where we are in this process for our planning. We hired Stantec to do the route natural resource inventory and determine what the priorities are, along with city staff members, to determine how we could work in collaboration to do these restoration projects. So that scoping and stakeholder consultation has been completed last year. We're now moving into a public review of the draft. It's available on the website that's listed below here. This QR code will take you there as well. That after going to that site, you'll be able to find the current draft plans that are available, as well as an interactive map in which the public is able to scroll and make points of interest and comments in a geographic fashion to determine and provide feedback to us as to what they'd like to see along these trails and what kinds of natural features stand out to them. At the end of this month, May 27th, we will be closing the review period and bring this back to the Dakota County Planning Commission Citizen Advisory Board, and they will provide their recommendations to adopt this plan to the County Board of Commissions, and hopefully by summer 2022 we're looking at a plan adoption. And with that, I'd be happy to hear any questions that you might have, and maybe thank you for letting me speak to you tonight.
I just have a question. Is there any long-term projection on when the Greenway would be done, or is there, past the approval of the plan, is there anything on the calendar as far as project deadlines?
I don't have a firm date set for when trail is established. The remaining portions of the trail will be established, and so that would be another portion of the county, the planning department, that would be able to speak to those dates in particular, and the phasing that's involved in the actual trail installation. However, the natural areas that aren't affected by a trail installation could certainly be or have been reviewed in this process, and certainly have been identified. So the timing of these restoration projects are largely up to opportunities that present themselves for grant funding and the willingness of the city partners and the county to start a project. So it was deliberately not set as per a date timeline schedule for these restoration activities, but rather when both parties are ready, we can enter into a joint powers agreement, and then we can begin a restoration sequence. And so that's how it's written in the plan here, is with a 5-year plan as the partners are ready to begin.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the table for land cover change in the corridor. I'm not sure if it was in the.
So this is within the plan itself.
Yep,
Can you
on
read
page
my-
82.
Okay, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe that is a contemplation of what the existing land cover is, and then what it could be as after restoration activities.
Yep.
Okay, so there are, in particular for, do you want me to talk specifically to some of the city parks in Burnsville about the table 4
Yes, please.
specifications? Okay. I'm working off of memory here, but I believe in Rudy Kramer, there were no significant suggestions for native community plant manipulations other than enhancements along the trail corridor. There's an area that on the southern part of the trail, before it starts to switch back up the hill there, that could be establish back to native prairie vegetation. Currently, it's an altered grassland. And in Sunset Ponds, there were suggestions to do manipulations along the shoreline to establish native cover of the shoreline there and replacing the hybrid cattail. And in Kelleher Park, the current land cover in the northern part of the park is an altered oak forest, and some canopy manipulations and buckthorn removal would reestablish that as a oak woodland and savanna. There may be additional details in that table that I'm currently not in recollection of, but I believe that's the bulk of what we're suggesting in this plan. So largely, again, in lockstep with the natural resource management update.
Sounds good. I was looking at the area for decrease when it comes to the marsh and the swamp areas and the wetlands is what I'm particularly concerned about, but it sounds like the only changes there would be just kind of refurbishing, so to speak, the shoreline to make sure that that's healthy and thriving.
Yeah, I think our goal in all these manipulations is to bring the vegetative quality to a higher level. So anytime we're managing invasive species, and hybrid cattail it's a difficult species to manage, and so it might not be a high priority item to do those manipulations, but it's something that any opportunities we can have to reintroduce native emergent vegetation is a goal.
Perfect, thank you. Right. Anything else? Well, thank you very much.
Again, thanks for allowing me to speak tonight. Right.
All right. And now we move on to our 2021 Deer Management Review Report in consideration for our 2022 hunt dates and rules changes. Caleb, we invite you to come up and give us some updates.
All right, thank you, Commissioners. All right, well, thank you for having me tonight. I'm here to present our annual deer management update, and my name is Caleb Ashling, and I'm a natural resources specialist for the city. And I think commissioners may be familiar with a little bit of this background, but I'll say it anyways. The Natural Resources Master Plan in 1999 recommended that the city develop a deer management program. And that initiated the deer management plan being developed and adopted by City Council in 2001. And this did a number of things, but one of those major things was set a population density goal for the city. And the program is intended to address a few different concerns related to the deer population. One is the potential for high numbers of deer vehicle collisions when the deer population is high. Another is negative impacts to natural areas. When you have a lot of deer, they can do a lot of damage to the native plants in our parks. Another is landscaping depredation by deer, so causing damage to residential properties. And then disease risk in the deer population. When you have higher deer densities, you're more likely to get disease to spread in the population. And so what I'll be doing tonight is reporting on our past program year and then making recommendations for our upcoming program year. And so the way this program runs is that, so for our upcoming program year, for example, we'll be talking from April 1st of this year till March 31st of 2023. So there's a few different details related to the program, the education component, a feeding ban component, monitoring of the population, and population control. So we'll hit on each of those separately. The first item is education. So we always try to provide some education to residents on deer-related issues, especially related to the city's deer feeding ban. We do try to put that information on our website, and we also use our city newsletter to publish reminders about the deer feeding ban, as well as using social media and other tools to get the word out. And then on to the city's deer feeding ban. So it is against ordinance to feed deer in Burnsville. And so some of these issues are sometimes reported to city staff by the public. And when that happens, the city staff follow up on it. There were 3 violations that were reported in 2021. And all of those issues were rectified through action letters, where we send a notification letter and get the issue to stop through that means. So we haven't issued any fines or anything like that. So it's more of an educational tool to get the feeding to stop. And we recommend just continuing with these monitoring and action letters as needed. And then for monitoring, there's 2 major components of our monitoring program. The first is an aerial deer count, and the second is tallying of deer vehicle collisions. And for our monitoring program, you'll note that we use 6 different management zones that will kind of assess the population differently. The northeast, northwest, west central, east central, southwest, and southeast zones. So our most recent aerial count was conducted on January 31st of 2022. So this aerial count is conducted by helicopter. The helicopter has flown over some of the priority natural areas in the city, and deer are counted from the air. And this survey is conducted for us by the Three Rivers Park District. So we have a great partnership with them. They also fly surveys for the city of Bloomington, sometimes the Wildlife Refuge, and then for their own purposes in Murphy-Hanrahan Park Reserve. So we're able to use them to fly our survey as well, which is cost effective. And so the aerial survey, this map here shows circles where the deer were seen, and the little number within that circle is how many deer were seen at that location. And the total count was 190 deer, which was down from the count in the past couple of years of over 200. The areas where they saw the most deer during the survey was the southwest zone with 53 deer down there. That's the area around Keller Park and Murphy-Hanrahan Park. Followed by the northeast zone, which is where the Wildlife Refuge is, but also some considerable populations in the east central zone and southeast as well. And then for monitoring, I also mentioned that we monitor deer vehicle-related collisions, and we consider this a minimum number of collisions in the city. The way we track this information is we get a report from our police department on any police reports in their system related to deer. Then we also have an animal control contractor who picks up deer carcasses along the roadway. We cross-reference those reports to account for any collisions that would not be reported to the police, and then we map it, and that's where we get this map and total collision number. And for this past year, we had a minimum of 44 deer vehicle-related collisions. The largest number was in the southwest zone, which kind of correlates with the area where we have had the highest population. And then followed by the east central, especially around Terrace Oaks and County Road 11, that had 13 there. So this number is a fairly average number for us, and lower than the pre-program numbers in the 60s and 70s. And so we recommend continuing with these annual monitoring methods this upcoming program year. And moving on to population control. So our program allows for a couple different ways to control the deer population. The first is through archery hunting, and the second is through sharpshooting conducted by our police department. And for our archery program, we encourage archery hunting on private property where possible. It's not possible in most of the smaller lots in Burnsville, but there are some areas, especially in southwest Burnsville, where people have larger lots and ordinance would allow them to do private property sharpshooting. And then we operate archery hunts on public land where possible. Our current public hunt is at Keller Lake Park. So for our archery program last year, there were 6 deer harvested in the city's archery hunt at Keller Lake Park. There also is a hunt at Murphy-Hanrahan Park in southwest Burnsville. That's conducted by the Three Rivers Park District. A portion of that park, approximately 10%, is within Burnsville. So we consider approximately 10% of their harvest for our program count. So about 3 deer considered to be removed from Burnsville from their hunt as well. Then for our sharpshooting program, we utilize Burnsville Police Department sharpshooters and work at specific sharpshooting sites which are selected for their safety. And we conducted sharpshooting in the northeast, east central, and southeast units this past winter. And there were 30 deer harvested through that program over the course of 5 sharpshooting events. And this table here looks at the goals for harvest for this past program year, and then the actual harvest that was conducted. So in that northwest zone, we don't have any accessible land in that area to do any management, so we didn't conduct or attempt any there. In the west central zone, we had a removal goal of 0, so no management was conducted there. In the southwest zone, there were 9 deer removed through archery. And so there was quite a few more deer there to potentially remove, but 9 were what we were able to achieve through archery. In the northeast zone, we had pretty high removal goals, and we were able to harvest 19 deer in that area, so getting closer to those goals. In the east central zone, we removed 2 deer, and then in the southeast, we removed 9 out of the maximum of 10 deer we could harvest in that area. So for a total between archery and sharpshooting of 39 deer harvested. And so that was looking back at our past program year. Now looking forward at recommendations for our upcoming program year. So this would be this upcoming fall and winter. So in this table here, we have the population goal for each of our management units. We have a projected fall population that's based on the aerial survey, and then factoring in for fawn birth in the spring, as well as some natural mortality to get an estimate of what that population would be this upcoming fall. And then from that, this gives a potential range to harvest or reduce the population to get towards that desired population goal. So in the west central, or in the northwest, again, there's no areas where we can conduct management in that area. West central, there's a potential harvest of 11 to 14. In the southwest, where we manage through archery, 31 to 48. Northeast, 0 to 19. East central, 21 to 29. And southeast, 43 to 46. And for recommendations, we recommend sharpshooting in the northeast, east central, and southeast units. There is potential, based on that table, to do some management in the west central part of town as well. But historically, we haven't seen a lot of long-term deer-related issues there. And because we have a fair amount of potential deer to harvest in those other areas, we think it'd be best to focus on those other zones. And then the sharpshooting locations would be determined by deer activity within those zones. And then for population control for archery, we recommend continuing with the archery hunt at Keller Lake Park. This hunt is facilitated by the Metro Bow Hunters Resource Base. which I'll refer to as MBRB because it's a lot easier. They are a nonprofit group that helps organizations like cities conduct these population control hunts in suburban or urban environments. And we do have a proposed change that we'd like commissioners to review related to the Keller Park archery hunt. And so we are proposing to combine the Keller Park archery hunt with the Murphy-Hanrahan Park archery hunt. So for many years, the city has had our hunt that's facilitated by the MBRB group, and the Three Rivers Park District has had their own hunt that's facilitated by the MBRB group. And in talking with Three Rivers Park District, we both thought there was opportunity to combine these hunts to get some efficiency and simplify things a little bit for the hunt. So these hunts would still be facilitated or organized through the Metro Bow Hunters Resource Base. Three Rivers Park District would take a lead role in coordinating, although city staff, like myself, would still be involved with them as well. And then part of this change would involve trying to align the park hunt rules between the organizations to make it easier to facilitate the hunt, so it's all the same across the hunt area. And the benefits that we see related to this change is better coordination between hunters. So rather than having these two separate hunting groups out there with different hunt coordinators, there'd be the same hunt coordinators between the different areas, and hunters could be set up and organized according more to what's the most effective way to hunt an area as opposed to where the property boundaries are. It's also simpler for park users and adjacent properties because our hunt dates didn't always align between the two different hunts. If we joined the hunts, then the hunts would be on the same days at the same time. So if you live in that area, you'd know the exact time when you wouldn't be able to use those park areas. Then it's also just an opportunity to strengthen interagency partnerships between the city and the Three Rivers Park District, and also reduce some redundant staff time in organizing the hunts. And just to give you a little bit of a visual on kind of what that means and what the layout is of the area. The red area here is the area that would be hunted within the city park. And in the lower left corner, you see the dark green. That's the adjacent area of Murphy-Hanrahan. That continues quite a bit, which I'll show you in a minute. And we used to also hunt in the upper right portion of Keller Park as well. But the regional trail now goes through that area. So that's that line there. And with the regional trail, that area we decided to remove from the huntable area, which reduces the size of our Keller hunt and makes it all adjacent to Murphy-Hanrahan Park Reserve and in areas where, for the most part, there's very little trails or regular use of the area by people. And then, so just to give you a little bit of a context on our city park related to the larger Murphy-Hanrahan Park Reserve and why this makes some sense for Three Rivers as well. They have a really big park, and they're coordinating their deer hunt, not through the entire area, but a good portion of the larger green section of this map that's outlined in yellow. That's all Murphy-Hanrahan Park Reserve. So they're hunting or organizing a hunt for this pretty large area, and for them it's relatively easy to add on this red hashed area in the upper right, which is Keller Park. But for us, it saves some efficiencies as well to combine the two. So I think it makes sense for both parties. And then on to adjusting some of the hunt rules so they align with the way Three Rivers has run their hunts. The first rule change that we're proposing is adjusting the proficiency testing requirements and using the MBRB group's standard proficiency instead of sharpshooting. The vast majority of MBRB hunts already use the standard proficiency. Our hunt was always organized as requiring sharpshooter status, which is something that most other hunts have gone away from at this point, because they haven't really seen a difference in potential wounding rates, whether you're using standard proficiency or sharpshooter. But we have kept it up until this point, but I think this is a good point to change and align with the majority of the other hunts that are out there. And just to give you an idea of what that means, so all hunters that participate in these hunts have to take a test to make sure that they're proficient with their bow. And for the sharpshooter status, you have to put 5 out of 5 arrows in, this is a 4-inch circle here from 20 yards. For the standard proficiency, which is what we're proposing to change it to, you have to put 5 out of 5 arrows in this 7-inch larger circle. But that 7-inch circle is still very proficient and the size of the vital zones of a deer, so you can still effectively harvest deer if you can make that shot. So
And who oversees those tests?
it's usually a hunting range area, so they have certified people at the shooting ranges that certify that. And then another rule that we propose to change is to adjust the antlerless requirement. So most of the Metro Bow Hunters resource bases don't require you to harvest, don't have any restrictions on whether you harvest a buck or a doe. For our hunts, we have had a restriction in place where you have to harvest a doe first in the early periods of our hunt. And then if you either harvest a doe or you put in enough time, then in the later periods you can harvest a buck. Just in general, to put some emphasis, because harvesting does is the best way to control the population. That's why we have had that requirement in the past. But what Three Rivers Park District has found is that that in general, the MBRB hunts have about a 75% antlerless harvest. So the majority of deer that are being harvested are antlerless deer, primarily does. And that hunters in general are signing up for this because they know that these are population control hunts. They're out there to harvest deer, so it's not really necessary to put those antlerless requirements on the hunts. And we agree that that's an acceptable change for our hunt, or we're proposing that change. Then the last one is that field dressing entrails may be left in the woods as long as they're 25 yards from the trail. So previously, our hunt rules require hunters to, when they harvest a deer, they have to field dress and remove those entrails and then bag them and remove them from the park. Three Rivers, for their hunts for many, many years, has allowed them to be left in the woods as long as they're not right near a trail. And for our hunt, because there aren't a lot of trails in that area, we're harvesting 6 to 7 deer. As long as they're being left in the woods, we feel that that would be acceptable. Three Rivers has also said that they find that those entrail piles are generally cleaned up. There's coyotes, there's foxes, they're not out there very long. They get cleaned up pretty quickly. So we feel like that would be an acceptable change for our hunt as well. And then on to the hunt dates. So we're proposing that then the merged Keller and Murphy-Hanrahan Park hunts would be run October 14th through the 16th and November 11th through the 13th. And then before I move on to questions, just one thing we'll be requesting commissioners is to consider and recommend approval of the hunt dates, and also to consider and recommend approval of the hunt rule changes. But with that, I'd like to, or be happy to answer any questions people have.
Just a quick question on the 44 car accidents. Do all those deer die, and do you include those in how many were harvested during that year period?
There's no way to know for sure whether all those deer die. Probably a large percentage of them do. And we do not factor them into the population counts because we conduct an aerial survey after that.
Okay.
So we have an updated count post the assessment of those collisions, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks.
other questions? All right, so you are needing us to vote tonight. So anyone want to motion to recommend moving forward with the changes of the dates and the rules?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, and all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? All right, and it passes. Thank you very much. All right, and we'll move on to the next item of our agenda, which is State of the Lakes Presentation Review Annual Water Quality. And it's Caleb still.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Commissioners. And again, so I'm here to present State of the Lakes as well, our annual update on water quality in the city. Again, my name is Caleb, a Natural Resources Specialist with the city. And so just kind of a reminder for how the watershed works in Burnsville. Burnsville is part of three major watersheds. The first is the Credit River watershed, so the Keller Park that we were talking about in southwest Burnsville, the area in green on the map, that all drains towards the Credit River. The second is the Vermilion River watershed, so Lake Alamagnet and some area around Lake Alamagnet in orange on this map drain towards the Vermilion River. And then the majority of Burnsville is within the Minnesota River drainage area. So the area in tan all drains eventually to the Minnesota River. And in that watershed, the way water moves through our major storm sewer pipes is it runs from Lac Lavon to Keller Lake, Keller to Crystal, onto Twin Lakes, where it's joined by water from Wood Pond, where it flows to Early Lake, Sunset Pond, through Kramer Nature Preserve, and then on to the Minnesota River. And then in the northeast part of town, those areas drain through a number of different ponds and storm pipes towards Black Dog and Nichols Lake, which drain into the Minnesota River as well. So Burnsville has a large network of storm sewer pipes, so 185 miles of storm sewers and 6,500 storm drains. So this really big network helps us manage floods and rain events and also manage other water quality related issues. These storms and pipes are all connected to our large networks of ponds, lakes, and wetlands. So we have nearly 300 ponds and lakes that are connected to this system as well. And I'll be talking about water quality in a couple different ways. One is the state water quality standards. So the state has standards that vary whether it's a shallow lake or a deep lake. And some of the criteria that they're primarily looking at is phosphorus, chlorophyll A, which is a measure of algae, and water clarity. And if a lake fails to meet 2 or more of these standards over a 10-year period, then you end up on the state's Impaired Waters list, which triggers a whole process of assessing the watershed and the lake to determine how to reduce the population and get it to meet state standards. The city has 2 lakes that are currently on that Impaired Waters list. The first is Alamagnet Lake, and the second is Keller. The city has previously had 2 waters on that impaired list that have since been removed. One is Crystal Lake that was removed in 2018 because water quality had improved enough. And then Early Lake was removed from that list in, I believe it was 2012. So another way that we look at water quality is also through the city's water resources plan, clarity goals. So the city has clarity goals for each of our 8 priority water bodies, which are a little more strict than the state standards, so trying to achieve even better water quality or clarity than the state requires. And this chart here just lists each lake, our 3-year average clarity, along with the goal that our plan sets. And just in general, what we're seeing is we're either very close to or exceeding clarity goals in all of these lakes. I'll highlight our impaired waters here. So we have a 3-year average of 1.2 meter clarity on Alamagnet Lake. And so we're just a little below that clarity goal of 1.3 and above the state standard for that lake, which would be 1.0. So that's a positive improvement over past years. And then Keller Lake as well, the 3-year average there has been 1.3, which is above the city and state goal, which is the same for that one at 1.0 meters. And then I'm going to kind of quickly go through the water quality for the specific lakes, and instead of clarity this time look at the phosphorus levels. So this is a little bit of a busy chart here, but this is total phosphorus levels for the lake, starting with Lake Alamagnet, and it's totaled into the May through September average. So phosphorus samples are taken throughout May through September, and those samples are all averaged into one number for the season. And so for this, the orange line on here is the state standard, and we want those green bars to be below that orange line. That means that in that given year we met the state standard. And the long-term goal is if you're an impaired list, you need to average 10 years where you're below that state standard in order to get off that impaired waters list. So Lake Alamagnet, in general, over the past 20 years, has been trending towards lower and lower phosphorus, and we're close to meeting that clarity goal, which you saw on that last table, and we're getting closer, still a little ways to go on getting the phosphorus levels down to the state standard. But the last couple of years have been some of the better years over the last 10, and we believe part of that's due to recent water quality improvement projects within the watershed. And then moving on to Lac Lavon. So Lac Lavon is a deep lake, so the state phosphorus standard is 40 parts per billion for this one. And you can see Lac Lavon is really meeting the state standard, well below the state standards. It's actually one of the best water quality lakes in the South Metro area. So Lac Lavon's in really good shape. Part of that is because it's an old gravel pit. That just doesn't have a large history of nutrient enrichment because it's a created lake, and it also has a really small watershed. Then on to Keller Lake, which is our other current impaired water. Keller Lake is also trending towards lower phosphorus, and again meeting for the last couple years the clarity goals as well. And you can see the past 3 years, starting in 2019, we've been below the state standard for phosphorus. And so hopefully that trend continues and we'd be moving. Every year can vary, so we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but that's the trend that we'd like to see going forward. And part of that aligns well with water quality improvement projects, both within the watershed and then recent alum treatments within the lake as well. So just hitting on a couple of things related to Keller that have happened recently. So the second dose of alum was completed this past year. Alum is, if you're not familiar, aluminum sulfate, which is a non-toxic product that can be added to the water. It binds to phosphorus in the water column. It also settles to the bottom and then remains there. And if phosphorus is released from the sediment in the future, it also can bind that phosphorus. And it basically is a good tool to reduce all that phosphorus that's already in the lakes, accumulated over many years, and prevents that phosphorus release that can drive that in-lake algae bloom. So that is a really good tool to use when you have the watershed inflows in good control, so there's not as much phosphorus coming into the lake, and then now you can focus a little more on the phosphorus that's already been in there. And then for this upcoming year, we plan on the second round of native plant reintroductions. So we've been doing some work towards reintroducing good, desirable native plants into Keller Lake as well. So moving on to Crystal Lake. Crystal Lake has, as I mentioned, it came off the Impaired Waters list in 2018. And you can see from this graph here that it's been really improving through the years and getting less and less phosphorus, as well as improving in clarity. And it's in a really good place where it's well below state standards. And as far as clarity goes, the last couple years have been some of the best years on record for Crystal Lake for clarity. So Crystal Lake is definitely trending in the right direction. And then for Crystal, we had a couple recent projects this past year. One was replacing the outlet structure, which will help reduce the occurrences or duration of high water events on the lake. We also did a small native plant turf to native plant conversion within the parking lot island on Crystal Lake, which you see in the photo on the lower left here. We had an area with eroding soils and poor turf that we converted to native plants to provide habitat and reduce erosion. And then one of the big projects from a natural resources perspective was the Shoreline Stabilization project. So we worked with Dakota County Soil and Water Conservation District and received a grant to stabilize shoreline on about 1,000 feet between the boat launch and the Tayaki Park fishing pier. And you can see that in the photos here. Coir logging, these coconut fiber logs were staked to the shoreline. That helps buffer against wave action erosion. And then native plants were planted within and behind that coir log, along with the removal of buckthorn. And those native plants with their deep root systems will help stabilize the shoreline as well. Then Twin Lake. Twin Lake is a small lake that is just downstream of Crystal Lake. And for a small, relatively shallow lake, you can see that it's doing really well for meeting state standards, and in general is a downward trend in phosphorus as well. Twin Lake also received a new outlet in 2021. That helps it deal with large rain events and reduce flooding within that lake. And then related to some new development in the area, there was an expansion of a storm pond on North Twin Lake that helps reduce some phosphorus and runoff from that area as well. Then Wood Pond, another small, relatively shallow water body that's well below state standards for water quality. And in this graph, you can really see in 2019 a major drop in the phosphorus levels. And this is another water body that received a relatively recent alum treatment. So 2019, there was an alum treatment that was conducted, and you can really see the results of that alum treatment that have remained in the subsequent years following that treatment. Moving on to Early Lake. Early Lake is another shallow water body that came off the Impaired Waters list in 2012. And it's a pretty large watershed, so the nutrient levels, phosphorus levels are a little bit higher, but again, still below those state standard levels of 60. And Sunset Pond, the levels here in general have been trending slightly downward over the last 20 years, but we have seen the phosphorus levels tick up a little bit above that state standard in a few years. We're still averaging below the state standard for the course of the 10-year period, but that's something we'll continue to monitor and assess whether there's any trends in the wrong direction there, but so far the long-term average is still trending downward. So that's kind of my typical usual presentation is talking about the lakes, but we also, on Commissioner request, wanted to add some information about the Minnesota River into this program. So I'm going to talk a little bit about pollution prevention related to the Minnesota River. As commissioners know, the Minnesota River is a large drainage area covering all the way to the western part of the state. Up until where the Minnesota River meets the Mississippi River in the metro area. So it's a really big river system. It's a fairly polluted river, as you can see in the aerial photo here. So this is where the Minnesota River meets the Mississippi, and you can see that brown, milky colored water. Just a lot of sediment in that water from agricultural areas and high nutrient levels as well compared to the Mississippi. And Burnsville is a relatively small part of the overall picture of what's going on with the Minnesota River. And so there is a lot of great information on the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency about the larger watershed. A lot of that is sort of out of the scope of city staff and what we're involved in. But related to the city, when the city was receiving its new stormwater permit in 2021, there was a review of the city's watershed related to the drainage area to the Minnesota River. And basically there was a modeling system that the state developed for cities where they could assess their watershed based on standard modeling, and then the ponds and the best management practices that are within your watershed to see if you meet the state's requirements for how much sediment they predict would be going into the Minnesota River. So it's a little less of a detailed assessment than you see with a lake like Keller Lake, but because they're doing this with so many different cities all throughout the Minnesota River watershed, it has to be a little less specific and more of a modeling system. But with that said, that assessment showed that the city, our current best management practices that are in place within our watershed meet state requirements for phosphorus and sediment loading into the Minnesota River. And then a couple other ways that the city does help reduce pollution running into the Minnesota River. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of programs related to our lakes and reducing pollution in our lakes. And because the majority of that system runs to the Minnesota River, if we're reducing pollution in our lakes, that means we're putting cleaner water into the Minnesota River as well. And then we also maintain an extensive storm pond network. We're doing regular assessments on that infrastructure, doing sediment removal on those ponds to make sure that it's all functioning properly and removing sediment and nutrients. All that helps protect the river as well. Any new developments in the watershed are subject to water quality standards. So if you're adding new impervious surface with a new development, you have to meet the city's water quality standards as well as local watershed standards. So there's protections in place for any new developments that may be adding new impervious surface and requirements for adding rain gardens or storm ponds to rectify any new pollution. And then we also have education, like our landscaping for clean water workshops and grant programs that allow residents to install rain gardens or other best management practices that are going to help protect the Minnesota River as well. And then another fairly large study that was done a few years ago that focuses quite a bit on Minnesota River drainage areas was the Ravine stabilization study or slope stabilization study. And a lot of the Minnesota bluff areas are where we see some of the worst slope erosion. So the city did a study on where some of those areas are that were most likely to have slope failure or major erosion events. And through that study, identified those areas and then now has been working through a series of years to repair those projects. And that all reduces the amount of sediment that ends up in the Minnesota River. But there's been some major projects done at Black Dog Park, Willow Creek, which is near Kramer Nature Preserve. This is a photo on this page of Willow Creek here that shows this open water creek, and which was just kind of an open dirt area previously, but the city recently added rock riprap to help reduce erosion during high events and stabilize the area around it. And there's also been projects at Cedar Bridge Park and Tennessee Park. And here's just another example of one of those projects that was conducted. This is a site off Hayes Drive in Tennessee Park. And this shows on the before picture a major area where there's a lot of erosion on this steep slope here. And then the after project here, just stabilized with rock riprap and cribs to reduce that erosion, and that really protects all the downstream areas where that sediment and attached phosphorus goes to, which in a lot of these cases, including this one, is the Minnesota River. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments on our water quality update.
Thanks. I really always enjoy this presentation, see the progress we're making. Just a curiosity question. You mentioned, Kelly, you're going to add native plant restoration. How do you go about doing that? Do you actually like put seeds in, or do you actually plant individual plants? What's the process there?
Yeah, so for Keller Lake, Keller Lake has very little existing native plants, so really low diversity. So what we do is, for the aquatic plants, unlike upland plants, there really isn't anywhere where you can really go and buy native seeds. So the best way to do it is to harvest the actual plants, in a source lake nearby. So we have a source lake that the Three Rivers Park District has allowed us to harvest plants from. And we harvest them, we bring them into Keller Lake, and we have some fence plots that we fence off and plant them within. And we did the first round of that, I think it was 2 years ago, and we found pretty good survival of that first round. So we're going to do a second round this year to sort of bolster the population from that first round. And it's kind of going hand in hand with some work that we're doing to control invasive plant species like curly-leaf pondweed. And while we're removing those invasive plants, we're trying to bring some other native plants that can take their place.
What are some examples of those native plants that you're bringing in?
Yeah, so fernleaf pondweed is one, large-leaf pondweed, flat-stem pondweed, and water stargrass. Those were the 4 that we selected to bring in.
Very fun. Did you take before and after pictures? Because I would love to see that.
Yes. Yeah, we have quite a few photos of the actual planting process and before and after photos, which we'd be happy to share with commissioners.
That'd be amazing. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Caleb. It was very informative.
All right, thank you for
Appreciate your
having me.
time. All right, and then we will move on to our 7th agenda item, the Crystal Beach Master Plan. Garrett Beck, come and join us. We'd love to hear what you have going on.
There we go. All right. Good evening, commissioners. Thank you for a little bit of your time this evening. I'm going to be talking to you about our Crystal Beach Master Plan. A little bit about the agenda. We'll do a quick overview of Crystal Beach and what we have going on in that park these days. Talk about the purpose of the master plan and why we decided to do it on this particular location. And then I'll actually walk you through what staff and our consultant ISG have come up with as a proposal for the master plan for this park going forward. So here's a quick overview from above of Crystal Beach. This is one of our most popular destination parks that we have in our system from May through August. There's not a time on a nice summer day on the weekend when you come down here and the parking lot isn't full. We have picnic shelters that are rented out of our recreation office that are used for family events, for graduations, birthday parties, all kinds of things. The volleyball court is always heavily used with people out there. And then we have a playground in the trees here that you can't see very well, a concession building that we used to run concessions out of for many years. It is a restroom building as well, and we are still trying to do those types of services. Sometimes we've partnered with community groups to do that. Other times we've hired staff It's just been a real challenge the last couple of years, whether it was COVID or finding seasonal staff to come in and help sell concessions and do rentals out of that building. And then, of course, the beach. We stopped guarding this beach many years ago, but this is pretty much the only public beach in our system at this time. We used to have Lac Lavon and Crystal. Both were guarded for a period of time, but I wouldn't really say Lac Lavon is a swim beach any longer at this point. So because of those reasons, that's why you see without the city of Burnsville having a public pool for Burnsville residents, this is really the place to go for getting access to water during the summertime. So one of the purposes of this study, and I wouldn't say it's the only one, I think we've talked in the past about our park system was primarily built in the mid to late 80s. So we're constantly taking a look at, and again, the people who made decisions back then did a phenomenal job. We have a lot of great parks with a lot of diversity and amenities in it, but we want to make sure as we're making decisions on renovations that we're creating spaces that are going to serve our community well for the next 20 to 30 years. So when we're doing something significant in a park and when it's one of our community parks, it makes a lot of sense to come in and take a look at what is in there, what is still being used, what could we do differently, if anything, and then make decisions on how we do our renovations at that point. So for this particular park, the playground is one of the oldest in our park system. It is in need of repair, and it is planned to be done sometime this fall, if all goes well. Because this is such a popular park, there is a desire to improve and increase the capacity of this particular park. So again, that playground is well over 20 years, and 20 years old, and it simply, for as many people that are in this space and using the park, it really could use an upgrade from what is currently there. So as we worked with ISG, our consultant, it was kind of a fun process. I learned some things along the way, but and one of those things was Crystal Lake, actually way back in the 1880s and whatnot, and into the 1900s, people who lived in the Minneapolis area used Crystal Lake to build cabins, and that was their getaway from the city at that time. And so they captured some old photos of those cabins that were around the lake. There was a store back in the 1970s called Dolly's Place, and so as they were sharing that information, and as there's a lot of natural area around this, and I think just Burnsville in general has taken an approach to conserving and taking advantage of our natural areas, that we really decided that would be a theme for how we move forward. We looked at a number of different themes, and just looking at this cabin theme and a natural type facility made a lot of sense on how that could kind of drive the master plan for Crystal Lake. So when they started putting together some images of what that could mean, you know, there's a lot of different types of play equipment these days. They're built in such a way that they look natural, and yet they're still constructed so that they're durable and things like that. So looking at kind of a nature-based theme for the playground area, you can see how if we ever did anything with a removal of the concession building, how you could make it more of a pavilion type location that provided shelter from people from the sun that they could get away from, and still have spaces to picnic and look out onto the lake and whatnot, closer to the lake than where, not to remove our current picnic shelters, but just to provide a different type of experience in that area. And then you kind of see how you could build out from something like that and allow people to have access down to the lake area. You know, looking at possibly putting hammock groves or something like that. And there's a lot of talk about a fishing pier in this area. One of the things that we don't do right now is that we're not able to provide an accessible fishing pier in any of our parks at this point. And Crystal Lake is one of those places where we could be looking at that, and you'll see in one of the overheads how that could be possible in this particular area. So here's a potential site plan. Again, our goal was, one of my priorities is I didn't want to look at replacing a playground and do it in such a way that could negatively impact a master plan into the future, right? So wanted to work with our staff and the consultant to make sure that we were indeed still utilizing the right space and to reimagine what someone coming after us may choose to do with this space. But from a sustainability area, one of the things they recommended was reorienting the parking lot and putting some islands in there. By sending, right now the parking lot runs east-west, by having it run north-south, you could keep the cars further away from the lake and then have more active and passive spaces closer to the lake where people would want to be. So that made a lot of sense as we were talking through that, to take as much advantage of the lake view and the breeze coming off the lake as possible. So the volleyball courts and the picnic shelters and whatnot still have a lot of value. Those wouldn't change. But you can see this long path. Right now, one of our biggest challenges in our community is just the removal of trash and recycling. Our staff will drive their vehicles around to the cans and whatnot, but in order to keep up with it and to do it, they're often driving through grass and dirt and things like that, and those trucks over time leave the ruts and do damage to the turf. So you look at if we were to put in a paved path where right now our trucks are driving to pick up trash and then carry it along out to a fishing pier, we would not only solve the problem of having ruts and whatnot go in, but then we'd be able to deal with the accessibility and providing that fishing space that we currently can't do. So lots of good ideas, lots of things that could be done differently, and just trying to reimagine what that space may look like, again, at one of our most popular parks. So with that, I will pause to see if you have any questions or comments, any thought about, it might be a little nicer to leave this up on some of the things that consultant and staff have come up with, and just look for any feedback you might have as we continue to move forward with this.
It's a cool design. Is it somewhere online that you could look at more detail yet? Is it on the website?
So this is the first public presentation of it.
Okay.
So the goal was to bring it here before the commission, and ultimately we want to do some community engagement as well. But getting feedback from the commission here first before we put it out there was the reason why it's not currently.
Okay. So it's early in the process planning.
Yeah.
Got it.
My first question is, has there been studies on how often hammocks get used in a public setting?
There may be studies. I'm not aware of studies. I know that a very common thing these days is to create hammock groves. It helps protect trees, and hammocking has become a more popular thing, right? So you put in poles and whatnot, and then people bring their own and they set it up. But yeah, I don't know specifically, like, other than the fact that you hear it talked about a lot these days in college campuses, and we get phone calls from folks in the community that are concerned about trees possibly being damaged by hammocks and whatnot. So I don't know if I answered your question well or not, but
Okay, so it's not like you're gonna go there and there's gonna be a hammock there to be used. It's people bring their own in.
correct.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you for clarifying.
Sure.
And then my next question is, so I see that they're looking at or suggesting removing 30 to 35 trees and they're replacing those trees. Do they have ideas of what to replace those trees with?
You know, a project like this is, if folks coming after us decide to move forward, this is 10 to 15 years down the road. So this is really concept at this point, and to try to provide that guide. So as far as the specific details of what a building might look like, what ultimately the parking lot layout would be, what would go in the center islands, any of those things, for this stage of creating the master plan, that's just not we don't get into that specific detail, so.
So that's just kind of like something that's preparing down the road with global warming and climate change.
Correct. It's an understanding that when we do remove trees and whatnot, there's going to be a need to replace them and make sure that we're aware of that. Yep.
Perfect.
I'm just wondering, in the concept, are we thinking of keeping it, I guess, making it wheelchair accessible or accessible for everyone in the community? Or is that kind of something further down?
Yes, 100%. That is always one of our goals as we're going through things, is that we improve the accessibility on our locations. So one of the things in a partnership with the Lions Club that we were able to purchase, and JJ is working on the details. It's been a little harder than we thought, but there's a thing called a mobile mat or something along that lines, where we're able, if you look in the overhead here, we actually have a cement pad that goes down to the beach, which provides some accessibility. But as far as going north and south, it's a lot harder for whether it's a person in a wheelchair, whether it's somebody with a walking challenge, whether it's a mom or dad or grandparent with a small kid in a stroller. You're kind of stuck once you get there, and getting through the sand is challenging. So we're actually acquiring mats that can be laid out on the beach, and allows people to travel easier. And they can be easily rolled up for when our staff go out there and drag the beach and take care of it, and then they can be put back down. So whether it's something like that, or making sure that the playground has improved accessibility, or if some work is done in the building down the road, those are absolutely things that we are very passionate about and take a look at for sure.
Thank you.
And you were discussing the lifeguards earlier. I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts in bringing lifeguards back, or?
You know, there is not, and
Okay.
I'll leave it at that. You know, when I think, you know, both Mr. Ryan and myself were here when that change happened, and honestly, we wondered if we would get feedback from the community on the fact that we didn't have lifeguards down there, and there was a little bit, but it didn't happen. And there are so many unguarded beaches around the country now that I think people are used to it. And, you know, we just don't have the budget capacity to do that, so.
Okay.
All right, any other?
Yeah, just curious what your next steps are in this, like in the next 2 years, or?
Yeah, so next step, number one, if there's no significant concerns or whatever from this meeting, is to, like I said, do some community engagement this summer, out, actually sooner than later, out at the park and whatnot. But it's really time for me to start connecting with our local playground vendors here in Minnesota to come up with different options for the community to consider. And then we need to start moving on that replacement process. So that'll be number one, as far as seeing some action there. And then, you know, I'm not going to call it a completely low-hanging fruit, but again, if our goal is to get an accessible fishing pier in there, that is something that could become a project that wouldn't require completely redoing the parking lot, the concession building, where we're talking millions of dollars, right? So I think those are probably the two, from where we're at right now, of things that could be tackled sooner than later. And then the rest of it would really be a longer-term vision for the park when a greater renovation took place.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions? Perfect.
All right, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. All right. So our next meeting is June 6th, 2022. And we have our volunteer recognition event on May 4th from 5 to 7 at Best Western Nicollet Inn.
Commissioners, if I may jump in there, you should have received some information on that from either our city clerk or from another city staff person. I'm not sure if it was an RSVP event or not, but if you haven't, as I was walking out of City Hall today with our city clerk, she did say, go ahead and let us know if you're coming. So I know plans change daily for most people, so if you can make it, please join tomorrow night, or Wednesday night, I'm sorry.
Perfect, thank you. All right, at this time, I would like to request a call for adjournment of the May 2nd, 2022 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting.
I motion to adjourn.
There's
Second.
second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? We are adjourned. Have a wonderful evening.